Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the CTAC webinar, Dreading Those Difficult Conversations, What Supervisors Need to Know and Do to Hold Supervisees Accountable. Before we get started and introduce our presenter, just want to get through some webinar basics that are posted on our slide here. Everybody is currently muted. Also, please just to double check, make sure that your phones are also muted just in case. The slides and the recording for today's webinar will be posted on our website at ctacny.org within about 2 days. Everybody will be able to communicate with us to send questions, comments, feedback through the chat box. If you don't see a chat box on the right-hand side, hover at the bottom of your screen until you see a little talk bubble. Press that talk bubble and the chat box should open. When you submit a question or comment to us, just make sure you send to all panelists so that we can see your questions appropriately. We will also have a Q&A period at the end if your question doesn't get answered during the webinar. There will also be a feedback survey that pops up at the end after you exit out of the WebEx system, the webinar system. And we do ask you to please take a few seconds to complete that survey because we do look at that, your comments and your feedback and your recommendations after every webinar. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Anthony Salerno, who doesn't take much introduction. I think if you've been on each of our supervision webinars, I think since February, you should know him very well. A resident expert on supervision. He's a New York State licensed psychologist with over 30 years of public mental health experience in adult inpatient and outpatient settings, and he's also the Innovation Implementation Officer at the McSilver Institute at NYU. Thank you, and welcome, Tony.
Thanks very much, Lydia, and good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure for me to continue working with all of you, the supervisors out there, because you know, we've come to the conclusion that you are absolutely so critical to any efforts around improvement in any kind of like setting and workplace. Many of you have certainly seen me discuss many different topics. This topic of difficult conversations, you know, it's the first time I've actually been presenting on this topic. I think I've been avoiding it because I have some PTSD associated with some of the supervisory sessions that I've been involved in, especially being part of civil service in New York State. And I think those kind of dreading those conversations has somehow entered my psyche. So I'm wondering if that's why this is the first time. And often, out of all the things that we've heard supervisors ask us to do was, can we get a little more insight, a little better understanding, more information about how to handle these very challenging conversation that we have with supervisees who are, you know, around performance types of like issues and problems. So that's really our focus today. My goal is, I'm hoping that at the end of this, you would come away with a few ideas that would strengthen your courage, your knowledge, and your skills to engage the people that you supervise in a conversation that really is productive and that enhances both your supervisees' experience as well as yours. So the agenda is basically, why is it so hard? And like, how important is it? And then I want to share with you common mistakes. And usually when I have a section on common mistakes, I usually just look upon what I did over the last 35 years or so and look at those mistakes and then additional ones. What might be helpful strategies? I really went into the literature to see if we can also get a better understanding of how the industry in personnel services and the role of supervision, what do they have to share with us? And then looking at basically the role of feedback and the importance of body language and those sorts of things. So let's get started. So, you know, here are some topic areas that you may encounter, right? So what do you say to employees overindulged at a holiday party, right? The person who's generally silent at meetings and rarely interacts with others, the person does the work, but never seems to show an interest in supporting the team, never volunteers, never goes beyond their role, no matter what the circumstances. A lot of this I'm drawing from my own experience over the years. What about a very skillful therapist, supervisee, who delivers results, but also has a serious problem with getting paperwork, you know, done on time? And you say, oh man, this person is really terrific, so many things. now there's more hounding around this issue of paperwork. What to say to a diligent employee who dresses in an inappropriate manner, and who defines what's kind of inappropriate, right? I've been in situations and working in teams where that was like a real matter that went on for literally almost over a year. What about supervisors who's very vocal and continually makes negative comments about nearly every aspect of the work in the organization? Just the individual with like negative input. And you may have that kind of sort of situation. How about the very anxious, insecure employee who tends to blur boundaries with some of his or her clients, begins initiating hugs and repeatedly embracing a number of clients before and after sessions, or indiscriminately shares personal information about him or herself with clients? Have you encountered that? These are areas of hard conversations, right? How about the old timer? Oh, this one I'm very familiar with, who undermines the supervisor's position in meetings. When I was basically just coming out of school, getting my doctorate, and I was a supervisor, and wow, I was working with individuals who had been there a much longer time than me. They've developed significant informal power and can influence others. It's by rolling their eyes. They kind of communicate to the rest of the team. And I was like the newbie, right? But I was in the position of supervisor. Or how about there's Ned or Nancy, right? The one who needs to hear some feedback, but is always so wound up. You're really afraid the person will unleash a tirade of emotions and leave you asking yourself, why didn't I become an accountant? Why did I go into this field? Or how do you support a practitioner who manifests behavior that reflects a significant mental health or substance abuse problem? I've had to deal with that situation. Very difficult, very challenging. The clinician who receives negative feedback, complaints from two family members in the past month. So when you're getting complaints from people who are being either family members or the clients themselves, how do you handle that? The person who typically calls in sick or takes time off on Monday or Friday. The person who at times talks about clients in a demeaning and negative manner, right? After having been counseled on this before. So these are just some examples, and I'm sure you guys, if I gave you 5 minutes, you'd come up with another list of hard conversations. So these are really the challenges that supervisors, encounter, and how do you go about addressing this in a way that can be helpful? So there are some conversations that are just around general inattention to work tasks, right? The lateness and forgetting things, right? So here you can see a situation where the client's saying, my biggest problem with your performance is you've been distracted, and the person is basically wondering what they'll watch on TV tonight. So that's the person who's not engaged, right? They just, in terms of work performance, they don't set a high standard in terms of quality. Then you have team members who vie for position and advantage. Now, what are you to do, right? What's a supervisor to do? And you want to try to avoid favoritism and sibling rivalry among team members. You can have that dynamic. When that dynamic happens, if you want to talk about how to disrupt the team and lose cohesiveness, is when there is any kind of favoritism towards one or more. And that's always like an issue that you may have to encounter. And sometimes you encounter it because you were very close friends with some of your colleagues, coworkers, and then you got promoted. All of a sudden, the power differential changes. And that is not easy. I've been both in that situation myself, when where I was the supervisor, and then where someone I was close as a friend became my supervisor. And it can really be challenging unless both people kind of recognize that, it's been shift in the power, and then we have to find a new balance in the relationship that's still respectful and friendly, right? You don't want to lose relationships, but at the same time, it's an area that really requires discussion, and that can be a hard conversation as well. So I want now to just stop a moment, and if you could just chat in to all panelists, type in actual or real hard conversation dilemmas that you're currently facing or you anticipate facing with one or more supervisees. Let's get a sense of what some of the challenges you guys are encountering and likely to encounter or are currently encountering with folks. Recognizing that you're doing this sometimes from a distance, right? Because of all the COVID issues. But if you could just type some of those things in, and we'll sort of read some of them as they sort of appear in the chat. So you have veteran work undermining directives I've given. Okay, I get that one, right? That's the person who's just simply being kind of passively aggressive. showing lack of respect, poor boundaries, complaint. Wow, a lot of stuff is coming in. Former friends, just what I was mentioning, clinicians who are falsifying maybe some of the work that they're doing, not being productive, inability to follow directions, not keeping up with deadlines, giving a poor evaluation to someone who's been at the agency for years but never. Okay, so it's coming in so fast, folks. Fantastic. I guess that's why this is over. This is such an important issue that folks are talking about. Inconsistent work performance.
There's a lot on paperwork deadlines, either not meeting them or ignoring them, or there's also a feeling like they're always out. The employees who think they're always out to get them, that the company's always out to get them, for example. Yeah.
And the old timer undermining. So listen, I think some of the examples I gave were not too far off. And that many of those sort of align, and they have additional ones everywhere from disrespect. It's so hard to kind of wrap your arms around, how do I address somebody? What is disrespect? How can I actually operationalize that? All these issues. So response times on emails, working outside of the scope of practice, not meeting that. I mean, all these sorts of, after a while you wonder, maybe I could have gone into my dad's business or become an accountant or do something else, because this is our work. This is the challenge of being a supervisor, probably the toughest part of our work. At least that was true for me. Working with the clients who were experiencing very severe, mental health challenges, substance use problems, that was the nature of the work. But this aspect really became quite a challenging issue. Terrific. Thanks so much, folks, for sharing that. Okay, so I have a poll question. How likely will you be having a hard conversation in the next several weeks? A, you absolutely will, very likely, possibly, and probably not. So let me just do that for a moment. Give you a moment.
Yeah, so you can just click your response and hit submit, and then we'll leave the poll open for a couple seconds. We'll close it, and then when it reopens, we'll see some results.
Okay, can I be on? Okay. Okay. So we have, oh, wow. We have a huge number of folks who absolutely will, another very large number very likely, possibly, probably not. So the majority are needing to, this topic is very timely and very relevant. So my hope is that for those of you who will be having these conversations in the near future or in the more distant future, that you're going to feel a lot more confident in being able to go into it with a sense of purpose and likely to be more productive and effective. Now, how uncomfortable is it for you to have these conversations with your supervisee about work performance problems? So I'm just trying to get a sense of the level of discomfort, right? Is it A, very uncomfortable that you'd rather have a root canal? It's uncomfortable, just a little uncomfortable. Generally, you're okay with it, right? Or, you know what? No, listen, this part, I'm very comfortable with having to confront supervisees around these issues, just a piece of cake. Let's get a sense of how challenging this is for folks out there. Just give it a moment. It takes a little bit of a while for the system to aggregate the data. Some of you may notice I've changed location because I was outside, and my next door neighbor was beginning to mow the lawn. Okay, so we have really the largest is uncomfortable. A good number of folks this is really uncomfortable for them. Just a little uncomfortable. No one's very comfortable with this, but some are feeling like, look, I I'm feeling generally comfortable. So there is a whole range here, right? So I'm hoping to increase everybody's comfort level, no matter where they currently are. Okay, thanks very much, folks, for sharing that. So now I want to chat in. And if you just please type in why talking to a supervisee about a problem in performance can be very difficult. What emotions might it engender in you, the supervisor? What emotions might it engender in the supervisee? The issue is usually around the emotional aspects of this type of conversation. So you can just kind of type in a little bit from, let's get a sense of what you guys are thinking about out there. What goes on inside of you, and what are you concerned about what goes on inside of the supervisee? So we can get a sense of how you perceive some of the emotionality that is often the basis of the discomfort. And just use the chat box for that. Okay, defensiveness, anxiety, defensiveness. So this is coming in real fast. Maybe Lydia, if you could just, I can't read that.
Anxiety is a big thing that keeps coming up quite a bit in feelings of insecurity, frustration, anger, wanting the other person to really feel supported, hostility, defensiveness again comes up quite a bit, insecurity or imposter syndrome came up earlier as well, defensiveness.
Yeah. Great, I can see that. I'm really just impressed with, first of all, the level of engagement and participation from folks. So I appreciate that very much. Right, so it's all of that. It's all some of this, and the anticipation. So that's why people avoid this, right? But I find it really, really tough to overcome some of those negative kinds of feelings and worries, and then being able to, how do you get yourself in a psychological state where you're prepared for these kinds of reactions? And these were the very, very feelings that I had when I had to deal with supervisees. And over the years, it's been many, many, many people that I've supervised. These are exactly the experiences, right? Okay, thank you so much, folks. Really, really, very, very, very thoughtful. Okay, I want to go on because part of it is dealing with this emotionality, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to. And I would assume that most, if not all of you, have been in a clinical role if you're supervising clinicians, but some of you may not be supervising clinicians, may not be in a clinical role. So in some ways, for those who have, it's kind of drawing on some of those skills that one would apply in working with a client as one would apply in working with a supervisee. So here are some of the very common ineffective reactions. And I can very much identify with some of these, as well. Actually, I'm going to you guys just give me a moment. I'm just going to change my position here, and I'll be with
Thanks, everyone, for waiting. I know Tony will be back in just a second, and there he is.
Yeah, this is what COVID-19 has done. I have a house full of family members. All of them are working. Some are working on this floor. Some are working upstairs. And it's just been difficult. So thanks so much for your patience. I appreciate it. So let me get on to this thing, some ineffective things. And I've done many of these, and maybe you have done some of these things. Literally letting the person slip away. That is, you're really just avoiding it, right? Sometimes you're left to prayer that the person will somehow change. That's part of the avoidant thing. Convince yourself that this is not your job. Because you know what? No one's dealt with this person before. This has been going on for years. Now I have to do it? I've actually heard myself say that to myself. That's not one of my most stellar moments. I hope the person will leave. right? Sometimes it's intention. So it can make life miserable for this individual. You don't want to be in that kind of a situation. Hope you will get a different job, right? Saying to yourself, criticism of any kind will only make things worse. That's where you're saying, okay, I really shouldn't address this because remember all those things you guys just wrote down: criticism, hostility, defensiveness. Maybe this is just going to make things worse, or this person's impossible. We just have to put up with it. It's been going on for years, and I just shouldn't get too upset about it. Shying away from further confrontation. It didn't go so well the first time around. Powerlessness, right? The person is in a union or has a permanent status, right? And I'll be the one who ends up on trial. I've experienced this being in civil service, where some of these issues is 2 days later I have a shop steward in my office, right? Somebody from the union. And so you can get to the point where you feel powerless. You don't have authority for your supervisees in a way, but you don't have the level of authority. That's a difficult situation to be in. So I identify with that one. Well, this is a scary employee. I'm I'm not going to risk it. You may have some good reason to be a little bit concerned about a particular employee. So that can happen. So the other thing is also having a lot of guilt about it. Beginning like with an apology. That is usually not helpful because it's kind of like saying that you're sorry for something. But in reality, you're doing your job. And so that's an issue to be aware of because you could feel like anytime I confront somebody and they're not going to feel, I don't want them to feel bad or feel uncomfortable, that somehow I'm sorry for doing that. Well, think about that as well, right? Winging it. Avoid the process of thinking it through, planning and deciding. In other words, look, I'll have the talk, I'll try to get it out, but I don't really have a plan, right? And part of it is that it's uncomfortable to think about, the plan. Getting too emotional, waiting until you're really pissed off and collected enough ammunition to clobber the supervisee. That is a pretty common thing, like to the point where I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. That is usually not a good situation because your emotionality is very high. And then the client's experience is that you've been collecting ammunition and you're using it like a machine gun. Belaboring the point, right? You're not knowing how to end this process, hoping for a positive response. You need to convince yourself it was the right thing, to do. That is when you're having the conversation, right? You can find yourself stuck in that because one hasn't planned it out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of planning. Turning the conversation into debate or an argument, picking the wrong time and place, failing to follow up. That's a very common thing. We had the conversation. I told the person what they should do. Then they really don't change it very much. And that didn't go well. And you could, again, avoid it, but feeling like you did enough of your job by just, having brought it to the person's attention. Or waiting for the annual performance review. Okay, when that comes up, and all right, I'm going to collect all this stuff, and I'll bring it up then. The consequences of avoiding this, and I needed to appreciate this myself, is behavior doesn't change and your power has been reduced. So that's the other thing. You become less powerful. You had a reduction in your authority when you actually let negative behavior go on. And the other team members know it. That's the other piece of it. They know it. The behavior can get worse, right? Because you're not attending to it. It can infect other team members. I guess people are not held accountable around here. That can become a part of the culture of a team is that, look, people can kind of get away with what they want here. This is where the supervisor may be perceived as a pushover. Increased dissatisfaction and disaffection among other employees. Frustration, anger, resentment builds and it festers. So you're more, upset and pissed off. And that doesn't really help very much. More energy spent on intra-team conflict and divisive allegiances rather than on the work, right? Which is treating clients effectively. An overly punitive process resulting in a very angry employee who doesn't keep it to himself, right? That's the one thing is people oftentimes don't keep it to themselves, right? So if not handled well, whatever conversation you may have had with a employee may not stay confident. People will talk. And so now you have someone who is like bad-mouthing you, right? And if the person has some influence, again, it begins to negatively affect the perception of other team members, as well. The other side of the continuum is supervisor can be perceived as a pushover, right? You can let employees walk all over, and it's understandable, right? I have clear favorites. That's a real killer. They say sorry a lot. That's the issue around guilt. It's very important for you, in whatever time you're in your role of holding people accountable, that it's not something you're sorry about. It's part of the critical role that you have as a supervisor, or just fleeing any kind of confrontation, and people pick that up, right? Don't handle the problem employees, avoidance. Don't lead, and then everyone just sort of goes with the flow, or only give positive feedback, which of course is easier to do, or really say no, to folks, because you don't want to. Again, it's getting into that situation around avoiding confrontation. All understandable. We're all human. Human beings don't like confrontation, right? And so how do you make it not a confrontation? Now, I want to say something about performance reviews, because these are areas that sometimes a supervisor can use. This is where I'm going to get the real feedback to the people I supervise, right? Now, Edward Deming, who has done a lot of work in the area of quality improvement across industries all over the world, this is his view of performance appraisals, and I thought I would share that with you. The performance appraisal nourishes short-term performance, annihilates long-term planning, builds fear, demolishes teamwork, nourishes rivalry and politics. It leaves people bitter, crushed, bruised, battered, desolate, despondent, dejected, feeling inferior, some even depressed, unfit for work for weeks after receipt of a negative kind of rating, unable to comprehend why they are inferior. So this is a point he makes. You may or may not agree with that, but some of the one does annual performance appraisals well, but oftentimes the point he was making is sometimes they're not really done all that well, and it can, if it's not done well, that people get once a year, they get like all the feedback laid on them throughout the years, like nothing, right? Stuff may not be addressed at all. That's where the dilemma of avoiding hard conversation can kind of come in, right? And part of it, I think the second point is important. It is unfair, as it ascribes to the people in a group differences that may be caused totally by the system they work in. This is a very important point, because one of the approaches to effective supervision, especially around employee performance issues, is to engage in a check step to saying, is there anything that I'm doing as a supervisor or that is part of the culture of this organization that is contributing to the employee's poor performance or difficulties that they're having? Is there anything? So I think it starts off with also not making the assumption that every negative behavior you see is attributed exclusively to the personality characteristics of your supervisee. It's just an important check step, and it will give you an opportunity to think about how you solve some problems, because ultimately what you want to do is come to a resolution, right? You want to be able to solve this problem in a way that maintains the morale of the employee or maintains your morale. At least that's when one is kind of like looking to address. So I just want to make that particular point. I'll make it again later as well. So the dilemma of waiting for the annual appraisal, avoidance of uncomfortable conversations, right? So the evaluation was on Thursday. You say that I gave you a good evaluation on Wednesday. I have no recollection of that distant event. The idea about these evaluations, I don't know what your experience has been, but many of them people don't take very seriously. They just kind of go through it in a very rote kind of like way. They tend to be really very overly positive. We've had many situations in civil service anyway, where a really serious problem employee, and then one of the things the union would do is, let's take a look at the performance evaluations, and they were always positive, right? Because people were avoiding it all those years. And that becomes like a huge problem, because then really the onus of burden is put on the organization and the supervisor, whoever was filling out that evaluation. So that's a really important issue to address. So the point I think that we need to look is be open to the contribution of organizational policies, practices, and culture on the supervisee's performance. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It's nothing about the culture. It's nothing about your role as a supervisor. It is this particular employee's kind of behavior, the way in which they're approaching the work, or circumstances that are occurring in that person's life. You know, if you take a trauma-informed perspective and a resiliency perspective, what one recognizes is that there may be some factors in that person's life that's contributing to it. Typically, it's someone who's really been a good performer, and you begin to see someone who's like sliding. And that can be very much related to particular life conditions. But then there are others where, you know, this just seems to be a habitual pattern that seems to be independent of any particular life situation that's going on. So when you're being open to the contribution, you're going to be part of your conversation is to ask the employee's view of the situation and be open to some of the things that may relate to the organization. Do they see the problem as you do? Do they see the same problem or opportunity that you do to address this issue? Do barriers exist that interferes with this employee's ability to work effectively? Is it related to the common barriers is time and training and tools and temperament? And I do know that, you know, one of my challenges was in my work in a day hospital was paperwork, because I was both the director, I was running 9 groups a week, I had a caseload of about 25, you know, clients, I was a supervisor of 9 people, and I have to say, my paperwork, there was slippage in that. Folks weren't particularly sensitive to that issue, but when I look back at it, it really did have to do with the issue of time, and we didn't have really the tools. It was all handwritten kind of stuff, not so much on temperament, but it's just something to consider so that you're open to that rather than the focus of the problem is exclusively on the individual. At times it is, and at times it's not. Identify the degree to which these barriers exist and how you might be able to minimize them. Okay, so be reasonable and fair. That's like an important thing so that you can say to yourself, you know, this is something that needs to be addressed. I'm going to approach this in a fair and reasonable way. Your evaluation is based on the next 30 seconds. Go. So you need to be reasonable. And then, you know, I know what it's like to work in a punitive organizational culture. Some of you may be working in that and others not. So it's just important to kind of like recognize is the culture one that there's a lot of reinforcement around a more punitive type of approach. That makes it tougher on supervisors as well, because there's almost the expectation that one takes like a really hard-nosed approach to addressing some of these workforce issues. So now I'm going to just share with you some tips. And this is before the talk, right? Versus flying by the seat of your pants. During the talk versus losing control of the conversation, and after the talk versus I don't want to do that again. So let's take a look here. So before the talk, don't delay. The longer the delay, the harder it gets. Choose the right time and place. That is important. It's not off like, oh, hey, Joe, you know, why don't you come in here, have a few minutes. Do you have a few minutes? And then kind of, because you just want to, you can't take it anymore. You just want to get it out of your system because it's upsetting to you. But you need to really give it a time and a place. Less likely to have disruption, get privacy, confidentiality. Prepare for some of the scenarios. Before you have a difficult conversation, consider all the reactions. You may know this particular supervisee. Get a sense of how they may be reacting and think about how you're going to respond so that you don't feel like you get really derailed, right? That you get distracted by what your focus was because the person might bring up this issue or that issue. And decide if the third person should be present. There are times that you may be concerned where having a third person involved is something that you think is going to be increase your sense of like safety, all right? And at times that may be an issue for you. Before the talk, establish a problem-solving emotional mindset. Examine your emotional state. You need to be in as calm, serious, and emotionally regulated as possible. So that's where you don't kind of think that the way you get the courage to address this person is by getting so pissed off is that you just can't keep it in any longer. That's usually not the best situation to be in. Be curious. It isn't like I'm going to read the person the riot act. I'm just going to address this like to understand. Whatever the problem is, right? I'm just trying to understand, and I'm looking for solving this together. You're not in a courtroom. This is not a trial. You are not the prosecutor, and the staff member is not the accused. I have seen this happen, right, where it becomes like an accusatory kind of courtroom type of like atmosphere. it's pretty much all over if that's sort of the mindset that what I am as a prosecutor, and I'm going to find that the person is guilty and then sentence them to something. That's really not. But you can understand, it'd be very understandable to have that mindset. So focus on creating value. How are we going to make this conversation something valuable for me as a supervisor, for the program, and for the person? That's like an important mindset. This happens before the talk, right? This is a preparation. Oftentimes people don't go through the preparation. I don't remember going through a preparatory stage around these things. But in looking at all the literature, one of the big things that they talk about is this, is that you need to come in with a plan and a strategy, think this really through, create the time and the place, be emotionally prepared for it, think about how you want to open up the conversation, what do you want to focus on. Understand why you need to address it. Ask yourself, do I really need to have this conversation? You should ask yourself that, and why? Is it more difficult having the conversation or keeping the status quo? What's the upside and downside of just keeping things as they are? And is this really my job? What is the consequence of leaving the issue alone? So you have to be really very, very clear that the behavior of the employee is one that does require your attention. Balancing facts and perceptions. So make a distinction between what's a fact, things that you observe, hard data, and what's your impressions, your perceptions, your feelings, your beliefs. Hard data is difficult to refute and dismiss. So if someone is taking off Friday and Monday, then you can say, okay, look, here's the graph, right? 90% of all your time off has been Monday and Friday, which it leaves a burden on our team because you have folks who have to cover that. And a lot of clients come to us on Monday after a difficult weekend. We know that's very challenging. Or Friday, when people are anticipating a weekend without us, and that becomes challenging. That you have hard data. But there are other things that are more your perception, feelings, that's kind of subjective, but they're there, and they're important too, right? So how do you raise that conversation, right, and be able to share what are your perceptions, your beliefs, what you pick up, what you sense? That becomes more challenging, and that opens up like, well, how do I have a conversation about it? I don't want to just keep it to myself, just because I don't have hard data, but I have my data. I have the way I see the person behaving, their nonverbal, the things they don't do, in addition to what they do. So here's an example, just kind of think about how I might share this. So let's say you're one of my employees, and I was to say to you, look, I want to share an impression I'm getting, which may or may not be accurate, but I thought it would be helpful for us to discuss this. First, I have a number of positive impressions, such as, so you might want to start off with, here are some of my positive impressions, right? But on the other hand, I sometimes feel that you're not engaged in our morning planning sessions. I perceive your body language, your tone, really to be kind of uninterested and restless for the meeting to be over. I'm concerned because I think it affects the way the team experiences the morning meetings. These are just my impressions, so I wanted to get your take on what I'm saying. That's just one example of how you bring up something that's really an impression rather than hard data, but still important. Just because you don't have hard data doesn't mean you can avoid this process. You're experiencing something, you're detecting something, you're seeing the attitude or the behavior of other team members, and you may want to address it. Here's just sort of an example where you have to balance facts. The best is to have really hard data that can't be refuted, but that doesn't mean you don't have an opportunity to open up a conversation, even if it's difficult. The other is, again, this is all in the prep. So the vast majority of what you do to be effective, it happens before the talk. So empathic perspective, step into the supervisee's shoes. And really, it takes like an attitude of compassion, right? And then thinking about what it might feel like for the other person to get this kind of like feedback. So you may want to start by saying, I need to tell you something that might be difficult for you to hear. Consider what factors will be driving the person to act, say, or do things the way they're doing. Was the other person looking to get out of this situation? So this can help to kind of create a win-win situation. But I think what one has to do is to get out of the approach that this is sort of a prosecutorial, issue that's coming. And I have to convince the person that they're guilty. right? Have to persuade them that they're guilty. And then they have to serve a sentence, which hopefully is, that they do restitution or community service. What that means is correct the behavior, right? That it's almost a rehabilitation kind of issue. So thinking about that and maintaining empathic. If you wait long enough to be really pissed at the employee, it's very hard to be empathic. Very, very, very hard. And on the person's receiving end, they know that too. You're going to have very highly defensive supervisees. Who, me? I didn't do anything. That's a very, very common issue. People are going to defend themselves, right? No one wants to kind of admit that, really I am screwing up, or whatever the behavior that you're challenging might be. Right? So here are some of the things that could distract you. These are pitfalls that you have to be aware of. So you may have an employee who changes the subject. Why pick on me? You don't know what really goes on here. I actually do more work than others around here. What about Jane? She really does what you are accusing me of. That's the person who's trying to take the pressure off them, turning the tables on you. I just don't get support from you or anyone else in this program. This place sucks. Everything is so disorganized. In my other job, I didn't have any of these problems. I'm going to call my shop steward. My annual performance review said I was doing just fine. Right? So here's now you're on the defensive position or expressing outrage. How dare you, blah, 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 talk to me that way. Guilt induction. After all I've done for this program, how can you treat me this way? I'm going through a lot at home in my medical treatment. You should be ashamed of yourself. That doesn't mean the person isn't having issues, but the turning it on you is you should be ashamed of yourself for raising some of these issues. Those are distractions, right? Again, now we're going to go to during the talk, opening an initial statement. So I hope I made a point, and you guys will have copies of these if you wanted to take a look at it again. That's why I put a lot of text in it in the event that you guys want to review it so that you have some of that available. So during the talk, opening initial statements, thanks for finding time to meet with me. The purpose of this meeting, tell people what the purpose is, to discuss a number of concerns that I have and give you a chance to raise concerns that you may have, right? That's the empathic part. That's where you haven't come to a predetermined conclusion, right? You're saying this is a conversation, not a diatribe. This is not a prosecutorial, final statement. I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear, but my hope is that we end this meeting with a positive plan that works for the program and works for you. I'm raising these concerns with the hope that I will increase your success and satisfaction working here. What I'm trying to do is give you guys some opening lines, if that might be helpful to some of you. We both have a stake in addressing some concerns. I'll do my best to be a support to you in performing at your best. I'm most concerned about such and such. I believe it negatively affects such and such, and I would like us to find ways to address it. I like that one, right? Or how do you see? What are your thoughts and concerns that I've been raising? Again, these are possible opening statements. Your opening statement is a really important one that sets the frame. That puts the other person in a psychological framework. If you have other types of opening statements, it puts the person in a defensive position. This tends to avoid that. I hope that makes sense to folks. Another opening statement. I first want to start out with my observations of how you contribute to the team and the organization. There are also a couple areas for improvement. So this is where, some would suggest doing this kind of start out with the positive issue. I've also seen the literature, people were kind of like, nah, not so much. People won't even remember the positive once you get to the negative. And you don't want to dilute the issue or the person detects that you're just trying to soften them up and then hitting them over the head. So I don't know. I in my mind, I kind of tend to err on the side of recognizing the person's positive contributions. Another opening statement, there's a lot at stake for both of us. For you being successful and satisfied with the work, and for me, the morale of this team, along with how the organization views both of us. I want to resolve this issue, and I'd like to hear your viewpoint along with ideas on how we might move forward. Again, that's sort of another kind of an approach. During using I statements, right? It avoids defensiveness. You use the word you, the immediate reaction a person has is the feeling attacked, right? So starting with I statements, and I give you some examples. When I observe you coming in late or missing a meeting, I think that you have lost interest in our program and your team members. I believe it negatively impacts the entire sense that we are a team. I wonder if something has happened that is contributing to these problems. Okay, so that's like another thing to be cognizant of whether you're using I statements or you're using you statements towards the individual. Don't take it personally. And maybe you feel like Tina here, who has this statement. I'm a people pleaser at heart. I hate to upset somebody, but I've learned over the years that if I approach conversation from a place, I won't have it at all. Okay, so the idea of being able to find the truth of the matter. How the other person responds is up to them. All I can do is be honest and real. What that really means is what I can do is to be professional. That's what it really comes down to. I can be professional. I can be empathic. I can be a human being. I can be open, right? How the other person responds is their responsibility. But my responsibility is to address this issue in as professional a way as possible. Some suggest using a bad news approach. I've seen some in the literature saying they're for it, some are against it. So a difficult conversation is often better received when delivering you a bad news sandwich. So it's like the bad news is in the meat of the sandwich, right? Where the buns are the positive words, right? And you end on a positive. So it's kind of like start positive, then negative, or addressing a criticism and feedback, and then positive again. I'll leave it up to you guys to decide whether that works for you. The literature is really split on that approach, but I thought I would share that with you anyway. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the mindset stuff. Expect that the conversation will go well. Just expect that. Expect that the person's not going to be defensive. Expect that the person is going to have good intentions, and that your reputation will precede you. Be confident and direct, but open to the other person's perspective. Be open to identifying, taking responsibility. Anything you've done as a supervisor, and that could be just a direct question, right? So look, is there anything that in terms of how I'm sort of leading this team or the way I communicate, how I conduct meetings that's making it contributing to some of these issues? I'd like to know that as well, right? So that takes like a real openness. Language during the talk, what are you doing that you feel good about in this program? What do you find that is quite challenging and you struggle with? What would help you meet these challenges? Any thoughts on what you need to change to be most effective? So again, it's more like questioning, but a way of questioning so that you have better insight into the person's experience. That doesn't mean that you're not holding them accountable. It absolutely means you're holding them accountable. Now, one thing to avoid is a critical parent language. Words associated with critical parent kind of language, which just hooks the child in the person, more defensiveness, more arguing, more turning tables, all those pitfalls. So if you're saying words like you should, you must, why don't you, what were you thinking, what's wrong with you, I can't believe you did that, you don't listen, I'm not going to put up with this behavior for the last time, this is what you're going to do, and I don't want no ifs, ands, and buts about it. I don't think I have ever had an employee like you. Don't tell me you weren't inebriated at the staff picnic. You'd better apologize right now. All of this kind of stuff, this is all critical parent language. You don't want to hook the person's child. You want to hook the person's adult. Okay. And avoidance of hurt child. This is when you're really feeling like the person is making you look bad in a way, right? That is having a negative effect on your reputation and your perception as a leader. You're making me look bad when you do this. I don't know what else to do with you. I've never been so upset about an employee. You make the whole team look like flunkies. You're the only one who could get fired. You're not the only one who get fired. It's embarrassing when you do such and such. I'm so sorry you're upset about what I said to you. I didn't mean to get you upset. You're making me feel bad that I brought this up. I feel terrible having discussed it with you. And any use of expletives, right? That's just revealing that you're feeling in a powerless position, in a very highly frustrated position. So during the talk and on a solution, I'm going to move on a little bit. I think I've made this point. If you're telling an employee, the last section here, who failed to follow up with a number of families that call for assistance, right? So let's say that was the issue. You get a call, someone gets a message to you that such and such employee, the supervisee, hasn't been getting back to some families who have been calling because they want to know something about their loved one, right? And the focus would be what contributed to this problem from the employee's perspective. What steps to take immediately? How to ensure this doesn't happen again? Ask the employee for ideas on how to correct the problem. That's the other thing. The problem solving isn't on your burden to figure out what to do. You participate in that, but you really are having the employee engage in that problem solving process. After the talk, follow up. Some people have delayed reactions to bad news and may experience feelings of frustration embarrassment or resentment after leaving the conversation. Some people are very sensitive, right? And experience a hurt that is disproportionate to what you have given a feedback. Some might act out, which then becomes another difficult conversation, right? Sulking, increased hostility, uncooperative behavior. They also badmouth you. That's one of the issues here, is that person doesn't keep it to themselves. And they go around, with very, very negative, perceptions of you and sharing with others and embellish it quite a bit. Be aware of this and check on the person periodically, right? Which might be, a week later, a few days later, might say, listen, how you doing? I know we had a conversation about such and such. I just want to check in with you, right? Sometimes you might even want to, under certain circumstances, meet in a less formal setting, like a coffee shop, things like that, which might kind of like change, kind of more humanize it rather than the more formal process. But again, your comfort level with that is like really important, and the comfort level of your supervisee, around this. The body language is another piece, right? So the critical parent state, if you're in that framework, your body language is going to show. You don't have to even say anything. But I just wanted to share here's some pictures of body language. I'm just curious to know what you guys think. If you could rate it from 1 to 10. 1 is it's really going to cause much more harm than good. 5 is it's barely acceptable. The outcome can go either way. 10 is this is fantastic. It's the appropriate and professional body language. So let me just put that in. So here's the supervisor, Rayleigh. Rate it from 1 to 10. Just put it in the chat box. It's going to see what kind of numbers are coming in. 1 is just really terrible. 5 is I guess it's just sort of basically acceptable. 10 is fantastic. So we can just chat in, just a number from 1 to 10. Is anything coming in, Lydia?
Yeah, they tend to be towards between 1 and 5.
Okay.
And I think it's because the supervisor is the person with the hands on their head.
Oh, okay. Because no, the supervisor should be the other person.
Yeah, the one in the gray.
It may not be clear. Okay, it may not have been that clear. But again, I'd say from both ends, it's somewhere like, okay, no eye contact. Some people go up as 5, but most people are staying below like 5. Great. How about this one? The supervisor is the person on the left. 1 to 10.
So we're getting lots of 9s, 10s, 7s, 8s,
yeah.
On the higher end.
Right. So persons who are open. This is like really important. Some studies is that your body language is kind of communicates like 70% of your message. So very important to keep that in mind. How about this one with this supervisor? Okay, we got very
low scale, lots of 1s.
Yeah. This is not going to go well. You can already. It doesn't matter what doesn't matter if the supervisor is absolutely correct. It's not going to go well. How about this one? Very high.
On the higher end, the 9s, 10s.
Great. How about this one? Supervisor on the left. Yeah, very, very low.
Mm-hmm.
How about this supervisor? Tend to be on the lower end as well.
That one was kind of mixed, yeah.
Mixed one. That was a mixed one. This one tends to be positive.
Yeah.
How about this supervisor who's on the right? Yeah. You can already tell, the person's comfort level and all of that. So here's the last poll question. How would you describe the impact this webinar has had on you, at least at this point? If you can just share now that you've heard some of these things, and I know it's a lot, and you may want to go back to it again and review it a little bit more, but many of you are going to have to do something with in terms of a hard conversation. Are you feeling more confident that you can approach your next conversation with a little more confidence? Are you confident, but still kind of like, I'm still worried? Not so confident. You're still anxious about having these types of conversations. In other words, I haven't helped you very much. Or D, listen, I'm thinking about finding a non-supervisory job. I can't take it anymore. If folks would just kind of share. Give it a moment. Okay, so, well, I'm very, very gratified. I'm very gratified by the response. It seems like the vast majority really feel like they're much more confident, and others are more confident but still worried. And I probably think that's very understandable because it's still a difficult conversation. So I'm really very pleased that maybe there was at least one or two ideas. I have to tell you, I wish I had some of these ideas back in the day when I was supervising so many people, especially in a large psychiatric hospital. I fell into a lot of those traps and some of those pitfalls. And so I'm glad that some of these ideas can be very helpful to you. I don't think we have more than maybe, is there any questions that have come in or comments?
Yeah, so we have I think we can probably answer a couple that have come in.
Okay.
And so let me just grab those real quick. How do you handle if a difficult conversation was sprung on you by the supervisee, you weren't prepared to discuss it?
Oh, okay. So supervise, this is a whole different kind of dynamic now. This is a concern or a complaint that the supervisee has. I think some of the same principles would really apply. Say, okay, I can see that there's something that's really important that you want to raise with me. Let's just make sure that we have a time and a place and that we won't have any distractions. And I'm very much interested in hearing what one of your concerns are. And I think that's the way one would approach it. It's not like you wouldn't have a defensive reaction, but you would still want to make sure that you're not doing this while you're walking to the elevator, right? You want to find a time and a place and then say, okay, so, and then you would open it up saying, I hear that there's something that you wanted to talk to me about. There's a concern you have. I'm very much interested in understanding, what's on your mind. And then I think during the conversation, you would still keep a lot of those other issues in mind as well, so that you don't have the tables turned on you. But if you get very defensive right away, then in a way it puts you in a lower position. That person actually will have more power if you're in a more defensive position. So you say like, well, yes, of course, I'm very, very open and I welcome your concerns and thoughts. Next question.
Yeah. So what about when would be a good time to bring in a third person in, like another supervisor or somebody else? Like what would be those instances?
The instances would be when you are really concerned about that person's reaction. I did have supervised folks who really had some significant psychiatric difficulties, and I really was concerned. And so I brought in my supervisor. So that was an individual that I was really just wanting to have another person with me in the event that this person might would decompensate. That was my concern. The person was really struggling with some serious issues. The other is if you expect any aggressiveness. If you're really concerned about that person's reaction, or that individual would basically try to undermine you by calling in lawyers, notifying 50, 100,000 people about this, that they would go on social media and badmouth you. If you thought that it might make this big public reputation, I might have somebody else in there.
Great. And I think we'll take one more. There's a theme around sort of the organizational context. And what if it's an organization where they don't like firing people, or the higher ups aren't supportive or perpetuate the negative behavior, and so you're kind of left with dealing with it on a daily basis? The role that organizational culture kind of plays in this.
Yeah, you're really in a tough spot with that, because the culture is very, very powerful. I still believe that you need to engage in what is professionally, I think in many ways is an ethical and moral decision, that you still engage in that process, and then you do have conversations with the higher ups around how this is affecting your role as a supervisor. And if they undermine if that person feels like they can go over your head, then you have a serious problem. That's where your handicap. You have to just admit it, right? That you're handicapped in that situation. But I still believe that one still has a responsibility to address it And I think in those situations, you have to be even particularly careful that you address it in a highly professional way, that you document the conversation. I think in that situation, you document it a little bit more because you may not be getting the kind of like support. That has happened. I understand that issue. So that's the way I would approach that. You know, the other thing, the thing about having a third person, if you think that the individual might accuse you of some inappropriate behavior as a way of turning the tables, again, that's another way that you bring in a third person. I know we've got,
thank you so much.
This is the kind of topic I think we probably could have done an hour and a half on. But anyway, the bottom line is I hope that it's been helpful to some of you. I very much appreciate your interest in this area. We have some other upcoming events. Thursday, July 23rd, Positive Resourcing in Clinical Practice, Helping Students Adjust to the New Normal on July 28th, and Hiring Youth Peer Advocates. So as always, CTAC is always, trying to address your needs in many, many different forms and ways.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony. And a feedback survey will pop up. The reason for this webinar was that it was something that came in a lot of the feedback surveys is something that you all would be interested in. So we do read those. So please fill out the feedback survey. Also, feel free to email us at ctacny.info@nyu.edu if you have any additional questions. And also visit our website at ctacny.org for the slides and recording. It will be posted in the next couple of days. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well. Stay safe.